Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kirby, and I will be your conference operator today. At this time, I would like to welcome everyone to the Enhancing Community Involvement in the Regulatory Process conference call. And if during this time all of the lines has been placed on mute to prevent any background noise, and if you need assistance during the call, you may press star then zero on your telephone keypad, and an operator will come back online to assist you. Without further ado, let us all welcome Mr. Charles Lee. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kirby. Let me move the slide. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charles Lee. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for Environmental Justice at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I want to welcome you to our second webinar in an important series that is meant to advance environmental justice at the state level. This webinar series represents a strategic investment by U.S. EPA to systematically build long-term capacity to advance environmental justice at the state level. While these webinars are primarily meant for state leadership and staff, they are also meant for others because we have found that state progress on environmental justice has come about as a result of the concerted combined efforts of communities, academia, and government working together. Besides conducting training webinars, this project involves creating a repository of state environmental justice tools and resources that everyone can easily access and utilize. Hence, we are recording this and future webinars and will post them on EPA's newly launched Environmental Justice Learning Center website, the URL for which is on this slide. We had a very successful first webinar on April 16th, which focused on identifying and prioritizing environmentally impacted and vulnerable communities. Today, we are focusing on enhancing community involvement in the regulatory process. Among other things, we are very pleased that approximately 80% of the evaluation respondents for the first webinar said they intended to use one or more approaches learned in their own work. This speaks to an overarching premise of this webinar series, which posits that there is a set of rigorous analytical and practicable methods associated with the field of environmental justice that one can teach, learn, and implement. While in the past, there are many incredible success stories associated with environmental justice, they are left at the level of being anecdotal one-off examples. We hope to elevate this practice to a level of sound theory and methods, such that we can rigorously understand, analyze for, and devise approaches for integrating environmental justice into government decision-making and making replicable differences in our most overburdened communities. Nowhere is this premise more appropriate than in the realm of community involvement. Most people can sense when there are environmental inequities and disproportionate impacts, but are unable to articulate them, often being left to the idea of you know it when you see it. We want to articulate what are environmental justice concerns and translate this into systematic, methodical integration with government work practices. The impact of environmental justice on state public participation practices has been significant. As this webinar will go into more detail on, this has taken place mostly in the areas of EJ mapping, permitting, state environmental policy acts, and enforcement and compliance. Some state agencies, as you will hear, will have gone beyond just articulating changes in policy to integrating environmental justice and community involvement in their decision-making and overall agency culture. Before we go into our first presentation, I want to make sure to share with you some important logistical information. First, we will have 3 presentations today from U.S. EPA, from the University of Texas School of Law and the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control. After these presentations, we will open it up for questions and discussion. If you have a question, please use the question and answer pod in the Adobe Connect seminar room, and Lindsay Walsh from the EPA Office of Environmental Justice will keep track of them for us to pose to the speakers. We are asking you to type in your questions to ensure the best sound quality possible, as we are, as you know, recording this session. Needless to say, please mute your computers and phones. Second, we have provided the PowerPoint presentations in the document pod so that you can download them. Along with them, we have provided information on different public participation resources. Third, an evaluation will appear after the presentations, and we will greatly appreciate your filling it out.
Did we lose you, Charles?
No, we're just trying to move. Something happened to the pot. No. There she goes. Okay, great. Sorry about that. Before I go to our first presenter, before I introduce our first presenter, I want to say something that is common about all three of our presenters today. As you will hear, each of them is a pioneer in her own right, and we are fortunate to have them with us and to learn about the great cutting-edge work that goes on within communities, academia, and government agencies. Our first presentation will be an overview on enhancing community involvement in the regulatory process from Laura McKelvey. Laura is the group leader for the Community and Tribal Groups Program, Tribal Programs Group within the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards of U.S. EPA. There is probably no person better equipped to give this presentation than Laura, as she spearheaded the development of training on the Clean Air Act rulemaking and permitting processes for tribes and communities. Laura has worked for OAQPS since 1989. In that capacity, she has worked on acid rain issues, SO2, and led National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS, implementation, served as the team lead for the development of the Integrated Urban Air Toxic Strategy, served as the office's tribal program coordinator, and now leads a group that deals with tribal and community issues, including environmental justice. Laura is widely known throughout EPA as a person with a deep passion for tribes and communities. Her presentation is based on a pioneering body of work on tribal and community training on the Clean Air Act, something she helped to create. This training and associated engagement processes have produced very positive results on complex air rules for both communities and for agency rule writers. This work has been institutionalized through the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals and a series of community environmental justice trainings over the course of a decade. I am thrilled that we are now able to make this important information part of the repertoire of tools available to states. You gotta move it. Go, Laura. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Thanks, Charles. After that bio, I feel like I should just walk away now because it was kind of scary. So if you could keep going. What Charles asked me to do today is kind of lay the groundwork for the other two speakers. So I'm going to be kind of covering some of the framework for how EPA handles environmental justice and community engagement, and then give some examples of where the states are going above and beyond EPA's program. But just to get started, the EPA defines environmental justice as fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So that's very broad and encompassing. And as part of this meaningful involvement piece, meaningful involvement goes beyond just sending out fact sheets and checking a box. It really is making sure that impacted communities have an opportunity to participate, that their participation has a chance to influence the outcome of either the policy or the reg or the law that's being developed or implemented, and that their concerns are built into the process, that the agency listens to and understands their concerns so that the policy or reg development can be as responsive as possible. And EPA believes that it's the EPA staff responsibility to make sure that we bring these considerations into all of the aspects of the work that we're doing. And we're responsible for doing proactive outreach to bring the communities to the table so that they can actively engage and participate in an appropriate way. So Charles, if you go to the next slide. The International Association of Public Participation put together a diagram here that really shows a spectrum of how public participation evolves from the very lowest level to the most complex level over time, and that involvement will change depending on the nature of the action that's being taken, the importance to the community, and the ability, the authorities that the agencies might have, and the resources that are involved. And so if you look from on the left side of this spectrum, it starts out with the basic step of informing the public. And that information can include fact sheets, websites, open houses, really just to get the word out there. If you take a step beyond that, you get into the consulting level of public engagement, and that may be where you have not just here this rule is coming out with a fact sheet, but here this rule is coming out, and we really want your input. We want to have public comments. We want to have public meetings. We might have focus groups so that there's an opportunity to get clarity. From the community can ask information from the project lead, but also can provide input to the project lead on that specific effort. Then the next level is a two-way conversation. You know, do we have advisory groups? Are there workshops? Do we do, workshops are something that my group does quite often, where we might present to an impacted community what is in a proposed rule or what are the options that we're thinking about, and have them better understand both the authorities that we're using to develop the rule, but also some of the technology so that they can understand what that means, so that when they give us comments, they're more actionable, they are more informed, and then we get a better set of comments that we can work from. The next level up is collaboration, where you're actually got people involved in the regulatory process. So that can include consensus building, participatory decision making, really that the public becomes a partner in the development of the rule or the policy. And on the far end of the process, having actually the citizens make the decisions, and that can be through voting, citizen juries. Really the citizens are driving the decisions that are being made. Now, where EPA tends to fall in this spectrum is in the consultant involving stages. A lot of our authorities limit our regulatory abilities to go to the collaboration and empowerment stage. But as you look at this graph, it's really important to see that we develop our outreach and communication with communities based on one, our resources, two, the importance and the impacts on the communities, but we want to make this process as open as possible and get the communities as involved as possible. So Charles, if you go to the next slide, the IAP2, the International Association for Pollution Public Participation, has some core values that really capture how you determine your outreach on that spectrum. And that includes, making sure that people have a say in the decision-making process that affects them, that their input actually influences the decisions. A lot of times you hear from communities, they get frustrated because they go to these public meetings and they say things and it never makes a difference. So, make sure that their influences, that their input has influence. We can't take all the comments, but, we need to be responsive to the comments that we can be. We need to make sure that we understand that their needs and their interests, and that we need to also let them know how our process has met their needs. We need to make sure that we build a public outreach process that meets each individual community's needs, and that could be, for some communities, it's just a fact sheet for reaching out to a more informed communities. It may be the lower end of the spectrum, but if it's a community that's not been as involved with EPA, they may need more work and support than a more advanced community. So the next core principle is to involve the people that are most affected by the action, and that sometimes takes some homework. You may have to do some research on the community, know who community leaders are, listen to who they feel need to be involved, and it's maybe reaching out beyond our normal constituencies. So then when you're designing a public involvement piece, it's really important that the community be engaged in the planning and the development of that. So it's being responsive to their needs. Whenever we do a workshop in a community, they are part of the planning team, and so we build our trainings around what that community is interested in hearing within the scope of the action that's being taken. And then providing for the information needs of the participants. Sometimes we have to do a lot of background work to help people understand what's the state's role, what's EPA's role, what are our authorities, what we are allowed to do, what we can't do, so that they understand how the process works so that they can be better engaged. And then at the end, make sure we communicate back to people how we responded to their input. Sometimes this is a step we forget to do, but it's very important to continue to reinforce the building of trust that we might have down the road. So Charles, if you go to the next slide. So back in 1990, EPA adopted the original public involvement policy, and then we updated it in 2003. The fundamental premise of the policy is that EPA should continue to provide meaningful public involvement in all its programs and consistently look for new ways to enhance public input. EPA staff and managers should seek to input reflecting all points of view and should carefully consider that input when decisions are being made. They should work to ensure that decision-making processes are open and accessible to all interested groups, including those with limited financial and technical resources, English proficiency, and past experience in participating in environmental decision-making. And this last one is one that is really difficult to do because some people, working with the government can be intimidating to them, and so having one-on-one conversations prior to building trust are all an important piece of making sure that people who aren't used to working with the government feel comfortable working with us. So then the next purpose of the public involvement policy is it sets a framework for good public involvement, but it doesn't require us to go beyond any of our legal authorities that are put out by statute. So the policy also reminds, that all of these things are things that we need to aspire to. They're not necessarily things that are that push us beyond what we're allowed to do, but it should be something that's in our heads all the time as we're working to include the public in good rulemaking processes. Sorry about that. And then the most important piece of this is that we all recognize that public engagement is a goal that we always want to shoot for, but that there may be limitations in our resources, in our budget, so that we need to work through those as we're developing this process. And so the policy also lays out, with that in mind, all of these goals in mind, 7 steps to make sure that we do build off of and aspire to good public engagement. And those steps including the first step, plan and budget. Make sure that we're not waiting to the last minute, that we're not being reactive, that we're being proactive, but we're building that in within the time and the resource and budget constraints that we have. The second is identify who's impacted. You know, state agencies, it may be the industry, it may be other stakeholders that we're commonly used to, but we may need to do some more work and identify who's impacted at the community level. How do we find those folks? Who do we look to help identify those stakeholders? 3, considering stakeholders' assistance. Some folks may need travel. We may need to have some of the engagements in the evening instead of during the day so they can come after work. You know, we may need to provide food, and I know that's a limitation, legal limitation that we have in some places, but that also is a thing to consider. Do we need to do background technical capacity building for them to be able to participate in a meaningful way? Then we actually conduct the training and conduct the outreach, provide that information to folks, and make sure that that is done in a way that's accessible. And then use the feedback that they've given us in these processes to consider in our policy development and rulemaking processes. And then evaluate the effectiveness. We always learn from every workshop we do, every outreach training we do, how can we do it better? And that should also mean getting feedback from those that were involved in how to make it better. So if you go to the next slide. So just some hints from my experience and the experience of others, you know, how to do this on a personal level. I think, to me, you know, pretend like you're speaking to your mother. Your mother is an intelligent person who is not involved in the work you do. How do you explain it to her so that she can understand what you're doing? So that means you're going to be speaking in plain language to your mother. You're going to be clear. You're going to be respectful. And that's what we want you to do when you're talking to communities. Bring that same level of respect and clarity to the people that you're going to be working with. Seek out and encourage participation. That's, you know, sometimes we feel like we have to bend over backwards to bring in some of the communities that have not been involved with us in the past. And a lot of times that means an extra effort to build trust. And so making sure that you're setting a tone of being open and willing to listen to them and being responsive to the individual needs of that community group or that organization. Providing appropriate and meaningful avenues for input. Sometimes a conference call is great. Sometimes a webinar is great. but sometimes we have communities, I know I've worked with a lot of Alaska Native villages where they don't have great internet access. And so webinars don't work for them. So how do we build that kind of outreach and communication with those folks in a way that make it accessible to them? You know, I think another issue that we as government employees sometimes have is that we want to tell everybody what we know instead of listening to what they know. And that's a really important thing, to be open to listening to their input, to understand where their input is coming from. And sometimes that means listening not just at the words, but where's the underlying meaning? Where's the cultural pieces of that we need to kind of engage in? And that really means a lot of active listening skills and sometimes repeat listening, just so that you may not get it the first time. Let's hear it again, and so that we can fully understand the input we're receiving. And then being responsive, you know, change our approach if it's necessary. And that's not just changing the approach in the rulemaking and the policy development, but it may be that we may have to switch gears in the middle of the outreach process. If something's not working, we can't just say, well, this is our plan at the beginning and just stick with that. We have to be flexible and be responsive to changing our approach if what we're doing is not working. So tips for engaging with communities is to do some homework. Know who you're talking to. Spend some time doing some research before you start that outreach process. Find some allies in the community that you can work with and partner with to help establish a level of trust in those communities, to make sure that you're not just walking in blind and may unintentionally step on landmines that you weren't aware of. So make sure, one of the key things that we always do, whether it's a conference call or if it's a webinar or if it's a community engagement, we want to build that engagement with the community input. That helps in a lot of different ways. One, it helps make the engagement responsive to their needs, but also if they're part of the process, then they own the process, and it means that they're going to take the engagement more seriously themselves and bring more people to the table. And then just lastly, let's try to drop the EPA jargon. You know, we don't need to sound like Charlie Brown's teachers and do the wop, 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 wop that nobody else understands. So let's try to avoid acronyms and the EPA jargon. So Charles, if you go to the next slide. So, you know, I think there are virtually all the regulatory functions, both at the state and federal level, require some opportunity for public involvement. Public participation takes place in many forms, from public meetings to conference calls to formal hearings, informal workshops, and opportunities for written comments. We've got lots of good examples out there. For example, one that I'm very familiar with is the public comment opportunities in Title V of the Clean Air Act. So it ranges for everything from commenting on the permit to requesting a hearing to requesting petitions if the permitting agency does not respond to comments where the commenter believes they responded correctly. They can petition us. If they don't like the decisions on the petition, then they can appeal that. Citizens can also track compliance at the source, and there's citizen supervisions for civil court actions if the citizens find that the permittee is not in compliance with the permit. So that's, you know, one example of how the permit statutes lay out a very clear process for public engagement. Superfund also provides opportunities for technical assistance and resources for the impacted communities. It provides for identifying the needs of the communities and building that into the remediation processes. And then also, even under compliance as enforcement, there is opportunities for public engagement, but that varies depending on the statute involved, the type of violation involved, how the enforcement action is being taken. For example, in some states, under some statutes, there's a provision for public hearings or meetings on the proposed orders and may allow for citizen review and comment on the proposed compliance plans. Some states don't have specific, or some statutes don't have specific public involvement, but EPA seeks, where it's appropriate, to include public involvement as we're moving forward in implementing and enforcing our rules. So if you go to the next slide, Charles. So we also have some great examples where states have actually taken a lead in developing and enhancing public involvement. Permitting is one of one of the examples of where states have moved ahead, where they're including environmental justice and public participation practices. States like Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, and New Jersey all have additional public participation processes for environmental justice issues and have been included either in policy or statutes for those states. Mississippi has established a separate office devoted entirely to community engagement. Alaska has developed procedures for tribal engagement. California has new hazardous waste regs that require community involvement profiles and risk assessments and public involvement procedures to be considered, including past violations in the context of ongoing permit actions. South Carolina, who you're going to hear a lot from in the future, has integrated community involvement in its agency's culture and its decision-making, including community-driven collaborative problem-solving activities. And Massachusetts has a new State Environmental Policy Act, which requires enhanced public participation for environmental justice concerns and enhanced analysis. So those are some examples of in the policies and statutes of the programs. But a couple of examples of where the states have used public involvement in enforcement. One great example is in New York, where the community was doing bucket brigades and air monitoring, and they used that information and brought it to the state and EPA. And as a result of those actions, the state and EPA took additional action and took enforcement action at the Tonawanda Coke facility, which resulted in supplemental environmental projects and ongoing monitoring activities by the communities in that state. Also, California EPA Environmental Justice Enforcement Task Force focuses on community impacted, but they focus their enforcement efforts on communities that have multiple sources of pollutants and have disproportionate vulnerable communities. And in those cases, the community input shapes the task force and shapes any enforcement action that results from that. So if you go to the next slide, Charles. So these are some great resources on how to help communities be involved in the process, and I believe on your resource page we're going to have a link to all these resources so they're available for you. I particularly like this Art of Commenting document that's here, and these are resources that you should use in your exploration in the future. So if you go to the next page, and we're turning it over to Kelly.
Great. Thank you, Laura. That was great. Our second presentation is from Kelly Harrigan. It will be an advocate's perspective on how public agencies can better understand and make environmental justice communities a partner in their work. Kelly is a clinical professor and director of the Environmental Clinic at the University of Texas School of Law. The clinic's work focuses on helping low-income individuals and communities use environmental laws and the administrative process to reduce their pollution exposure and improve their communities. Prior to joining the clinic, Kelly worked as a legal counsel for nonprofits, including the Environmental Integrity Project in Washington, D.C., and Public Citizens Austin office. Like Laura McKelvey, Kelly is an expert on the Clean Air Act. Kelly has also helped to pioneer the use of civil rights law in the environmental justice context. Her clinic filed a Title VI administrative complaint and helped to negotiate a settlement on behalf of the residents of the Hillcrest community around the proposed Harbor Bridge project in Corpus Christi, Texas. This brought resolution to a decades-long fight for environmental justice and show how use of civil rights laws led to an agreement to tackle some of the lingering effects of segregation, discrimination, and environmental injustice in the neighborhood. One resident said of Kelly's work, and I quote, "These agreements have enabled us to move forward and create a livable and healthy future for ourselves," end of quote. So now I will turn it over to you, Kelly.
Thanks, Charles, and thanks to EPA for organizing this series of webinars and to my co-panelists. I've learned a lot from participating with them and preparing for the webinar. As Charles said, I'm the director of the Environmental Clinic, and we represent environmental justice communities and community members who are trying to use the regulatory process to protect public health, reduce pollution, and improve the quality of life in their neighborhoods. What I'll try to do is share from my experiences working alongside EJ communities and often feeling frustrated myself with the participation process and identify some things that would help me and the communities the clinic represents participate more meaningfully in the regulatory process. And I'd offer three initial thoughts, and these echo some of the things that Laura said. The first one is that one size doesn't fit all. Communities are different, environmental issues they face are different, and the regulatory processes are different in different states. So states have to build relationships with their EJ communities and ask what they need to be able to participate and tailor the process to meet their circumstances. Point two is that said, I do think there's some basic enhancements to the process that will likely help most communities be able to more meaningfully participate in the process, and I'll talk about some of those. And third, and echoing Laura again, and I think most importantly, the goal can't be just more involvement in the process. The goal has to be to work alongside communities to improve protection of public health, welfare, and the environment in impacted neighborhoods. The best designed public participation program in the world won't keep communities participating unless their participation is meaningful in that it can actually make change. So why should the environmental process provide for meaningful EJ community participation? The first reason is that EJ communities are on the front lines, and their health and their welfare are directly impacted by the regulatory process. Recent studies like EPA's 2018 PM study continue to confirm that particular communities, namely those who are low income or people of color, are regularly exposed to more and more excessive levels of pollution and are at greater risk to their health than the rest of the population. And protecting health and welfare is the core mission of most of the environmental statutes, and it's the basic reason most environmental agencies exist. So figuring out how to promote meaningful public participation so it will help protect the health and environment in EJ communities is really central to environmental agencies' core missions. The second reason is that community members have valuable knowledge that can support the regulatory and enforcement efforts of agencies. The EJ community members are on the ground 24/7, and they know things about regulated entities and about what's happening in their neighborhoods that agency staff aren't likely to know. They know which facilities regularly have excess air emissions on the weekends. They know about stream segments that may have suddenly had a lot of dead fish in them. They know where contaminated water is running off a waste site. And all of these kinds of facts are really valuable and relevant for helping environmental agencies in their permitting, rulemaking, and enforcement functions. And then lastly, community participation can help states develop creative solutions to solve real environmental problems, where the agency participation with the community is more than just responding in writing to comments on a permit and more than just hosting a formal community meeting, where agency staff can actually develop relationships with community members and others who are working with the communities. Environmental agencies can play a much more creative, engaging, and in my mind, a more rewarding role in crafting solutions to community environmental problems. The other important reason for agencies to focus on environmental justice is because agencies have obligations under the civil rights laws. As recipients of federal funding, state agencies must comply with EPA's non-discrimination rules. And those rules require states to ensure that public participation programs are available to everyone, to ensure that the programs don't create disparate impacts on the basis of race, color, national origin, disability, sex, or age, and national origin includes limited English proficiency. And they require them to ensure that where an environmental program has caused past discrimination, the state takes steps to provide remedies to people who have been injured by that past discrimination. And there are obvious overlaps between meeting these civil rights requirements and addressing environmental justice issues. Both EPA's Office of Civil Rights and the U.S. Department of Justice have guidance on complying with civil rights laws in the context of environmental public participation. And DOJ also has put out a procedural safeguards checklist, which is what it has used in investigating and resolving civil rights complaints against state agencies. And that checklist includes items such as translating vital documents and having language access plans, having technical staff available to answer questions from the public about draft permits, and developing community descriptions that include background and demographics, and developing lists of community-specific environmental issues. And as the quote on the green side of the slide indicates, it's important to recognize that compliance with the environmental laws and participation requirements alone doesn't assure compliance with the civil rights non-discrimination requirements. The states may need to enhance programs beyond what's required by the environmental laws in order to meet those civil rights requirements. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about some ways to encourage participation, and this slide lists some of those. But first, you may have to work to build up trust with communities. There's very common perceptions in EJ communities that environmental processes are unfair, they're biased to favor industry, and that participation doesn't really affect outcomes. In many EJ communities, the everyday lives of people and their families are adversely affected by pollution sources, whether it's smells caused by air emissions or flares that wake kids up in the night or water that's not safe to drink. People are living with these problems on a daily basis, and they impact their ability to use and enjoy their homes and their yards, and they make them concerned about impacts on their health and on their family's health. And people are often understandably angry and may direct that anger at the next state employee that encourages them to participate in a process that the community hasn't found meaningful in the past. So it may take time to build up trust and to actually give the community examples of how participation can make a difference. So first, some ideas for getting to know and engaging with EJ communities. The first one is to assign a community liaison, have a staff person to be a point of contact for each EJ community. Second, ask community members how to improve the process for their neighborhoods. Where should you hold meetings? When should you hold meetings? What are the best ways to actually get real notice out to people? Get to know the community, the organizations in the community, the religious institutions, the local businesses. Sometimes I find that agencies will identify one person or maybe a few people in a community and then rely on those people as the voice of the community. And communities are diverse and people have different perspectives, and those perspectives can change over time. So it's important to reach out broadly in communities. To that end, you can both attend community meetings and host regular community meetings. You can attend meetings so you can learn about community issues and organizations, and host meetings so that you can provide information about agency actions that will impact the community and get input about priority environmental issues in particular neighborhoods. Research community history and gather data. The last webinar was focused on gathering data and mapping information about EJ communities. But it's also important to understand the history of communities. In many of these areas, the reasons communities of color are exposed to more pollution can be traced back to segregation, redlining, racial zoning, restrictive covenants, and it's important to understand that community history. And then once you've gathered all that information, make it accessible to the community so they know you actually care about those issues and can correct any errors. Make it available to the regulated entities in the area, and make it available and required reading really for all agency staff that work in that community. And then this information and the community relationships can be used to develop a community-specific participation plan. And while these plans should be tailored to individual communities' needs, this slide attempts to list some basic things that would probably help most EJ communities participate in the process. The first is early notice. I think early notice is really essential for permitting and rulemaking. When people are just given 30 days to gather all the agency files, do their research, maybe talk to experts, and draft comments, it's just not enough. They're also working normal jobs and taking care of their kids, so they need more time to meaningfully participate in the process. And you can let them know, let communities know as soon as you know about a potential permit application or a potential rulemaking. Second, prepare meaningful fact sheets that explain agency actions and their impacts on a particular EJ community or their potential impacts, and explain how the community can get involved in that process. Translate and provide interpretation. Certainly any notice and any fact sheets need to be translated into relevant languages, but also other key documents that are necessary for someone to really participate in the process. And someone needs to be available to answer questions about a permit application or a rulemaking in languages that are relevant to impacted communities. Also, make agency files easy to access. It can be incredibly frustrating to try to go get information at an environmental agency in the file rooms. Don't require community members to go through a formal open records process if it's unnecessary. Don't allow regulated entities to claim as confidential things like air emissions data that aren't confidential. And as much as possible, make materials available online and in a searchable format. For rulemakings, or policies, if your stakeholder groups are made up mostly of regulated entities, you should change the way you hold those meetings. Hold the meetings in the evening when people with daytime jobs can attend, or if that's not a good time for everyone, hold 2 meetings at different times of day. You can hold meetings in the most impacted communities and someplace where there's a playground or a park, so if people's kids come with them to meetings, they have something to do. Make sure the site's ADA compliant, and be ready to respond to needs for translation or for assistance for people who may be hearing impaired. And then for enforcement, prioritize responding to complaints and bringing enforcement actions in EJ communities, and work with those communities ahead of time to develop lists of supplemental environmental projects that you can then urge violators to include in enforcement settlements. And beyond providing opportunities for participating in the process, as Laura mentioned, it's really important to help give community members the skills that they need to participate effectively in the process. So that means providing trainings. People need trainings on how to participate in permitting specific to individual types of permits, how to participate in rulemaking, and to the extent they can in enforcement processes. even trainings on how to access information from the agency, either the agency's website or through a file room, and how to participate in cleanup actions. And you can hold trainings in person, and you can record those trainings and make them available online for people who can't attend in person. Providing materials like fact sheets are important, and guides to explain to people how the public participation process works. And I think maybe most importantly is to provide people sample documents, like sample comments on an NSR permit, sample comments on a water discharge permit. Those documents really make people feel more comfortable in knowing what their comments should look like and the kind of things that they can put in comments. You should also provide technical assistance. A lot of times community members feel like agency technical staff either don't want to talk with them or aren't supposed to talk with them. So you can facilitate that communication. You can also identify and connect community members with technical and legal pro bono resources outside of the agency, and that might include agency retirees, universities, Engineers Without Borders, law school environmental clinics, or legal aid organizations. You can also help communities find funding. There's lots of grant resources out there. EPA has several, but communities often aren't familiar with them. There's also funding at other agencies like HUD, Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as foundations that can be really useful in helping communities achieve their goals. And just knowing what's out there so that you can connect communities to those resources is very helpful. And lastly, on monitoring, you can focus the agency resources, their monitoring resources, on environmental justice communities, but you can also help communities figure out what monitoring they might be able to do on their own, whether it's water sampling or installing, some of the newer air sensors, and then help them understand what data they're going to gather and what that can actually be used for. I think the EPA state community air permit trainings that Laura mentioned are really a good model for putting on trainings. They were jointly developed by EPA states and community members, and they brought everyone together in an environment that was less contentious than when there's a particular permit at issue or a particular pollution episode at issue, and allowed people to get to know each other in that environment. They were also state-specific, which I think is really important. They provided overviews of programs, but also really detailed advice about how to raise relevant permitting issues like BACT and modeling and monitoring. And the trainings included a lot of actual practice, drafting, and then discussing permit comments. And finally, the materials were made available so that community members could take them home. And many of those materials from trainings that I participated in over a decade ago, I still find really useful. And probably most importantly, all of this participation has to make a difference. You know, people aren't going to keep participating if they feel like it's not possible to influence the process and to improve outcomes for their neighborhoods. As I noted earlier, agencies do have an obligation under the Civil Rights Act to ensure that programs aren't implemented in a way that defeats the health and environmental protection goals for particular individuals of a particular race, color, national origin, or sex. And to ensure this, some state programs directly address discrimination in their statutes or regulations. Some states specifically address issues like cumulative impacts that are obviously relevant. Other states may need to look more creatively at existing statutes and rules to see how EJ and civil rights issues can be addressed. Some examples that I thought of would be general requirements for protection of health and the environment. Some states have prohibitions on creating nuisance conditions. Some states require consideration of socioeconomic impacts in certain decisions, and many states and many rules require monitoring sufficient to assure compliance. And all of these types of requirements can be used to strengthen pollution controls and monitoring in EJ communities. And you can help communities frame their issues and frame their comments so that they can be addressed by these types of provisions. As another example, from the Clean Air Act, there are regulatory provisions that can easily address EJ concerns. Like new source review, the provision on the left explicitly requires an analysis showing that the benefits of a permitted project outweigh its environmental and social costs. Then there are requirements like the PSD provisions on the right that don't specifically address EJ concerns, but they do allow agencies to broadly take into account other relevant considerations, costs, and air quality impacts. And these, too, can be used to reduce pollution in environmental justice communities. And where an agency can't fully address a community issue or maybe can't address it in a timely manner, agencies can coordinate with others who can help solve community problems. Local governments may have land use authority and may require zoning changes or special use permits before an industrial facility can locate or expand. Local governments often can enforce agency rules. Health authorities may be able to help address nuisance conditions like odors or flies. And EPA may have brownfields grants that could help get a community waste site cleaned up. And by working collaboratively with these other types of entities and with EJ community members, it's possible to craft creative solutions to solve environmental problems and to protect civil rights. An example from here in Texas, this is actually a photo of a mountain of about 55,000 tons of asphalt shingles and shingle pieces. It was about 5 stories tall. And it was located in Dallas, directly across a creek from a neighborhood with a mostly black population. And pieces were washing into the creek and into people's backyards. Mrs. Jackson, whose backyard backed right up to this site, suffered from a black dust that was blowing off the pile and affecting her breathing and her granddaughter's asthma. So residents formed a coalition called Southern Sector Rising, and they partnered with other local groups like Downwinders at Risk and with legal aid, and began getting media attention and reaching out to elected officials and agencies. And as a result, they got the Texas Environmental Agency and the City of Dallas to jointly conduct an investigation. The Texas agency went out and found violations for the failure to have a fire prevention plan or adequate financial resources for cleanup, and the case was referred to state agency enforcement, which can be a slow process sometimes. In the meantime, the city filed suit in state court for 18 violations of the city code, and at a hearing last month, on April 10th, the city and the company agreed to a settlement that requires the facility to shut down and move all the shingles off site within 90 days. Southern Sector Rising is now working to ensure that the shingles don't just end up as a mountain in somebody else's backyard, and they're also working to urge the City of Dallas to adopt an environmental justice policy and ordinances to protect against future industrial encroachments into EJ neighborhoods. So in this case, Southern Sector Rising and its partners, the state agency and the city, each contributed to solving a very real problem that was impacting an environmental justice community. In closing, this slide has my takeaways for making it easier and more meaningful for communities to participate in the environmental process. Each semester in the clinic, I do exit interviews with my students who finished their work representing clients in the environmental process. And I pretty uniformly hear that they're surprised at how hard it is to participate in the process. Putting, I guess, a glass half full spin on that means there are lots of opportunities and steps that can be taken under existing laws and existing regulations to make participation easier and more meaningful and to actually reduce pollution and improve health and the everyday lives in EJ communities. Thanks.
Thank you, Kelly. And we will now go to Laura Boyce. She will focus on how a state environmental agency has integrated community involvement and environmental justice into its agency culture. Laura is the Community Engagement Coordinator for the South Carolina Department of Environmental Control's Office of Environmental Affairs. She enhances and facilitates community engagement activities across all environmental programs and assists staff in developing solutions using collaborative problem-solving techniques. She has been leading community engagement efforts at South Carolina DHEC for over 10 years. In that time, she has trained staff on the concepts of meaningful public participation, led work groups to educate and engage citizens and other stakeholders, and coached permit applicants on effective methods to build trustworthy relationships with communities. She also has led the effort to develop a public participation strategy for the agency's environmental divisions. I want to share her own words about how she feels about the work she does on an everyday basis. Quote, I am really proud of my state and the staff I work with at DHEC. When I became the public participation liaison for DHEC, I was thrilled to be able to provide a holistic perspective on building partnerships that bring about meaningful change to the very communities I've been connected to my entire life. So now we will bring you Laura Boyce from South Carolina DHEC.
Thank you, Charles, for this wonderful opportunity to share our experiences and some of the lessons that we've learned. And thank you also, Laura and Kelly, for providing such an excellent foundation of information. I'm excited to be able to provide some examples of how we, as a state environmental agency, have overcome some challenges and really have evolved our culture so that community involvement and really specifically environmental justice is at the forefront of our decision-making processes. DHEC in South Carolina is charged with promoting and protecting the health of the public and the environment in our state. Our agency is pretty unique in that it is both the public health agency and the environmental agency for the state. Our agency's vision is healthy people in healthy communities. Those of you who participated on the first webinar heard from the Director of Environmental Programs here in South Carolina, Myra Reese, and she said we've been working for many years to institutionalize community involvement and environmental justice as an integral part of our culture. We make decisions every day that impact communities, so we're constantly evaluating our processes to make changes that can really improve our communities. A lot of the work I'm about to share is really the result of the passion and dedication of many amazing people who have just blazed trails before me to make community engagement and environmental justice so ingrained in our agency's culture. We've really seen the benefits of environmental justice and how it leads to community revitalization and community empowerment. Promoting and protecting South Carolina's environmental resources requires consistent community involvement and ongoing communication among all of our stakeholders. One of the core responsibilities of the Office of Environmental Affairs is conducting education and outreach activities in a way that involves citizens in environmental protection. However, we haven't always gotten it right. The agency has had its share of harsh criticism for lack of public involvement and transparency in the past. So if we remember the slide that Laura discussed earlier, the spectrum of public participation, you'll remember that most basic level of public participation is informed, letting the public know about what is happening or being considered. In the past, our agency has relied on public notices in newspapers and maybe our website to keep people informed, but most community members really don't rely on legal ads or our webpage as a primary source of information. So we really needed to make some real cultural changes to ensure meaningful involvement for all the people that we serve. Not only is it required by laws and regulations like Kelly mentioned, it's really the only way we can carry out our vision and be responsible stewards of our resources. So we established a public participation task force with the fairly broad mission of establishing and maintaining credible relationships with the public. The task force included staff from all environmental program areas at all levels, and pretty quickly they were able to make some pretty drastic changes that impacted the overall decision-making process and our culture. The task force was able to survey staff to get a benchmark of what they understood about public participation. And then they established a consistent process for preparing for public meetings and public hearings. They developed an evaluation form to get feedback from attendees of those public meetings and hearings. They provided training on the fundamentals of environmental justice and public participation. And they held listening sessions around the state to get input from stakeholders on how we could improve our interactions with the public. So based on the feedback that we heard at these listening sessions, the task force really developed a community engagement strategy. We know that real engagement builds relationships through frequent interactions using multiple methods. So the strategy really places priority on raising public awareness, improving access to information, enhancing public notifications with a real emphasis on providing early notifications, and creating stakeholder advisory groups. We also enhanced our webpage to be a central location of information about issues that really impact our communities, more than just providing a list of public notices. We started incorporating the frequent use of postcards as a means to provide early notification of regulatory and permitting activities. And we incorporate the use of stakeholder groups to really guide our processes. As we became more intentional about how and when we inform, we put more emphasis on connecting with our communities where they are and educating them on environmental concerns, as well as how to get and stay involved. Meaningful engagement goes far beyond the public participation requirements found in regulations. I really like this graphic that was developed by the Bay Area Air Quality Management District because it shows the relationship between outreach and engagement. Outreach creates a foundation for building trust and credibility with the communities we serve. So they are more likely to get engaged with us, and they're better equipped to engage with us meaningfully. Attending community events, having an active social media presence, and getting public notices in the hands of those who are most impacted and most interested builds positive relationships without the complexities that can develop in permitting or regulatory processes. Don't overlook the value of building and nurturing relationships with your local communities. In order to reach true engagement, you have to embrace these 7 building blocks. These are really essential for meaningful community engagement. You'll notice that one of them is relationship building. EJ is a seed that brings people together, and similar to what Kelly was mentioning earlier, one way to encourage participation is to get to know those environmental justice communities and assign staff people to build relationships and be liaisons to those communities. As we continued to change our culture, we embedded community engagement staff within our environmental program areas. The primary function of these staff is to build relationships with communities, understand their needs, and engage with them in meaningful ways. These staff aren't separate. They're actually within the organizational structure of the environmental bureaus, and they report directly to the bureau chief. This structure is really critical because it allows them to be part of the Bureau's decision-making processes. Our community engagement staff attend weekly Bureau directors meetings so they can provide a community perspective that shapes decisions. These staff also work in conjunction with our technical and regulatory staff. Oftentimes we meet with a company before they submit an application, and during these meetings our technical staff, which are the permit writers and some decision makers, they're able to discuss regulatory requirements and potential challenges, while the community engagement staff are able to bring up potential community-related issues and needs. Many times the company that we're talking to knows very little about the community where they are considering their next project. So if that area is one that our community engagement staff has already been working in, they can make the company aware of the community's leaders and the interests and needs that community may have. These meetings have really allowed us to discuss challenges and create strategies with the companies to address community concerns and their needs early on. Our technical regulatory staff and our community engagement staff really work as a team to make permitting and regulatory decisions. One example of how our technical staff and our community engagement staff work in tandem took place in a rural area of South Carolina where a company had proposed to construct a new manufacturing facility. Again, the company didn't know much about that community, and the community didn't know anything about the company, but the location where they were proposing to locate the facility held a small grove of old pecan trees that still held a lot of value and identity for the community. When the company submitted the application for an air construction permit, the technical permitting review process and the public participation process kicked off simultaneously. While the technical staff were communicating with the company's environmental personnel about the regulatory and technical details, our community engagement staff were speaking with the company's executive officials about the community's concerns. Some members of the community were concerned with things like truck traffic and added pollution, but many of the community members were more concerned that the company was going to cut down those old pecan trees to build their new facility. Our community engagement staff were able to facilitate discussions between the company and those individual community members, and after hearing concerns from the community, the company actually changed the layout of their facility so that the pecan trees were preserved. We found that when companies understand the value of addressing the community's concerns, even when they're not related to an air quality or any kind of regulated issue, the community feels valued throughout the permitting process, and the outcome is a much more stronger, unified community. We have created some brochures and tips for companies to better understand why community involvement is important, how to get started, and when to capitalize on opportunities to engage with their surrounding community. We've also developed some tips to help community members know how to get engaged in our processes, why they should get involved, how to stay informed about local decisions, and how to make meaningful comments. As we educate our community members on how to make those effective comments on a permit, we also need to communicate our roles and limitations. Oftentimes, many community concerns are not within the agency's regulatory scope. However, just as Kelly mentioned earlier, those issues don't go away for the community just because we don't have the authority to address them. So as a state agency, we can and should facilitate connections to those who do have the authority and resources. We also use a public participation plan to assist our staff with determining the level of community engagement based on the significance of the action that's being proposed and the level of public interest, as well as the resources we have available for engagement. As the culture within environmental affairs has continued to evolve, our director, Myra Reese, has ensured that it is driven by these core values. These are the non-negotiable behaviors that define how we do our work. Community engagement with special emphasis on environmental justice is one of those driving factors. We've recently added this last one, which is collaborative partnerships. Everything we do naturally just involves thinking collaboratively. We seek other organizations and entities who have a similar interest, and we strive to work together to establish a common goal. As I mentioned earlier, environmental justice is often a seed that brings people to the table, and the first place for states to start is to really build trust and relationships with those environmental justice leaders in their communities. As you build relationships with local communities, look for opportunities to help them help themselves. oftentimes local leaders don't have a vision, or they have a vision, but they don't have the capacity within the community to make significant change, or they don't know about available resources. And oftentimes they don't have the stamina to sustain their efforts. In 2013, we really sought to strengthen our communities from within by partnering with EPA Region 4 and the University of South Carolina to hold an environmental leadership forum. The goals of that forum were to build upon existing leadership capacity within communities while educating the participants on regulatory roles, responsibilities, and environmental programs, and use that time to strengthen partnerships among community leaders, their local government officials, businesses and industries, and other entities within the community. The forum consisted of 4 two-day training workshops, and anyone in South Carolina who was interested in learning more about strengthening their community and the environment was eligible to apply. So we received applications from citizens, community groups, industries, and environmental groups, faith-based organizations, local and state governmental officials. One of the attendees of that leadership forum was a community leader who was very active and interested in making meaningful change in his community. He was from a low-income minority community and is very interested in environmental justice issues, specifically using alternative forms of energy to minimize costs and increase efficiencies in low-income communities. Because of the knowledge and connections that he gained from being a participant of the leadership forum, he later was asked to represent the environmental justice sector on the South Carolina Clean Energy Coalition. He really brought a very unique perspective to that coalition and has really grown since then. In fact, just this past week, his community organization was awarded the South Carolina Solar Council's 2019 Public Education Award for being a community solar champion. So to better engage with our most vulnerable communities, we've developed an environmental justice statewide work group called the EJ Hub, which is coordinated and led by our EJ coordinator and senior EJ advisor. The EJ Hub allows environmental justice leaders around the state to provide feedback on policies and initiatives that the agency is considering to ensure that EJ issues are incorporated into agency decisions and culture. The EJ Hub meetings allow those local environmental justice leaders to really work together and be able to engage in pilot projects for their communities while they receive assistance and guidance from DHEC and other state agencies. They also are given this time to really share ideas and network with each other. Each of the communities that are represented on this group has a very different focus. Some are focused on health issues, some are more focused on social issues like job training and assistance. Some are focused on energy, and others are focused more on infrastructure and flooding concerns. But environmental justice is the force that pulls those people together and to make communities better. Coming together as a statewide group has really allowed them to develop various tools for their communities to use so that they can become more engaged. As a result of the combined efforts and leveraged resources of this group, collectively they are using community-driven efforts to build solar farms in low-income communities, and they're utilizing every aspect of the project to benefit the community in some way. They're reducing energy costs, they're enhancing knowledge within the community, and they're even providing jobs for community members as in the installation of these solar farms. So we've really seen a lot of benefits of incorporating meaningful community engagement in regulatory and permitting processes. As we saw with the new company preserving that grove of pecan trees, when community concerns are addressed through a permitting process, even those that are outside the regulatory scope, relationships are built and better decisions are made. Just as Laura mentioned earlier in the first presentation, that local knowledge and experience and history provides a much better lens for decisions to be made from. And often the community members become the project's strongest advocates and can help bring a project to life, which reduces delays and last-minute issues that may come up. By developing and maintaining relationships throughout the process, future issues can even be managed and addressed collaboratively. There are some myths that we continue to hear and have heard about community engagement. The community may not agree with the experts about what's needed. Well, that is a bit of a myth because the community may not always agree, but it's much more likely to be supportive of the decision if it's been part of the decision-making process, even if the end result isn't desirable. Our goal is always to increase understanding overall. Another myth that we hear is that it's difficult to ensure that all the right people are at the table. This is somewhat of a myth because my advice is just get started. Just get started somewhere and you will see that the right people will find the table. Another myth we hear is that it's going to take time to educate the community. We've seen that streamlining our permitting process and allowing our community engagement staff to work parallel with our technical staff, we've been able to educate the community without delaying permit issuance times. Another myth that we keep hearing is that it's a waste of time because the results will be the same. Well, oftentimes community concerns can't be addressed through the regulatory process, but early engagement allows concerns that may not be addressed through regulations to be addressed collaboratively. And often many community concerns can be addressed in a way that actually opens channels for future communication. So as we continue to build on our experiences and the lessons that we've learned, we will continue engaging with communities in meaningful ways that meet them where they are. We will continue to educate communities on the permitting process and DHEC's role through stakeholder groups. We will continue to use our communities to help shape the website as we take advantage of the latest innovations in technology and website and social media navigation. We will utilize the tools and resources that are available to us now, such as a new e-permitting system that can provide automated notifications on application receipt, public notices, permit decisions, other decisions that we make as an agency. And we continually evaluate our internal processes to find ways to provide responses to communities that incorporate both environmental and public health resources. We have learned some lessons over time. Culture change in a large organization is difficult, and it doesn't happen overnight. We realize that staff in our local offices and staff at all levels are vital in developing relationships with key stakeholders. So living out those core values of community engagement and collaborative partnerships and always looking ahead to capitalize on innovative ways to continue to meet our community's needs are how we ensure that our communities here in South Carolina continue to improve.
Great. Thank you, Laura, and thank you to the three speakers for their great presentations. I am going to start the question and answer period. We didn't get too many questions, but before I do that, I wanted to make sure that everyone sees the evaluation which is coming up, and we would really encourage you to fill it out. I'm going to start by asking each of the presenters a question, and I will start with Laura. Laura, you are responsible for developing and implementing some community training and public participation processes for complex air rules like the Petroleum Refinery Rule and the PM 2.5 NAAQS. They, as I have said, have gotten extremely positive feedback from both the communities, the impacted communities, and agency rule writers. Can you kind of tell us what were some of the things that you did that made them so successful?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. I think the critical piece is, we wanted to make sure with both of those rules as examples that we were having in-person discussions with impacted communities. And so when we developed those trainings, we went to community leaders for the petroleum refinery rules. We started the conversations well before the rule proposals came out. And then when the proposals came out, we developed the trainings with fence line communities in Louisiana and in Oakland, California. So people had access to them. We talked about the authorities that we had, so people laid the expectations of what we were allowed to do and not allowed to do. But we developed those trainings in both places with the community. So they were similar, but they were different because they were driven by the communities themselves. We brought in community leaders to talk about their experience. It's really important for us to convey what we have to offer, but it's also really important to make sure that each of those trainings were designed to make sure the community had opportunities to influence the agenda, to bring in the people that they trusted to hear from them about the impacts of the proposals. And then we also built in time at the end of the trainings for them to work through their own comments with EPA experts in the room. So they had us not to help them develop the comments, but they had us there as a resource to help them understand. But they worked together to develop their comments. And so then when they went to the public hearings and they provided us comments, they gave us comments that we could really respond to. And with the petroleum refinery rule, we were able to use those comments in providing for fence line monitoring as a compliance methodology for the fugitive emissions from some of the tanks and other emission points on the petroleum refinery rule. So then we were able to go back to them and say, this is what we heard from you, this is how we responded to those comments. So that's how we do on a rule-specific basis. A lot of times for the trainings that we have around permits, those are source-specific, and again, in those situations, we try to develop the training with the community members involved, with the state agency, where possible, bring the industry to the table so that people have a chance to meet each other, engage with each other, hear the different perspectives, and build those engagements, again, around what the needs of those communities are. And so to me, the online training or the in-person trainings are critical to have the communities involved in developing their agendas.
Great, thank you, Laura. Next question is for Kelly, and you have spent most of your professional career representing communities which are environmentally overburdened and have suffered from decades of discrimination. What are some of the key messages you want to emphasize regarding what state agencies should do to meaningfully incorporate these communities in their decision-making processes?
Sure. So I think first just spending time in communities and listening and learning about what the issues are and what it's like to actually live in the communities near some of these pollution sources. And then try to implement, if it's not already there, the kind of culture change that South Carolina has implemented that sees the goal of public participation as really improving environmental quality and health in these EJ communities for the long term, that it's not just a checklist, of some procedures to follow, but it's really intended to make these communities healthier and to reduce their pollution exposure. And then I think to be creative in looking for solutions, because many of the problems in these EJ communities have persisted for decades, and they need inclusive and creative and multi-party solutions that are going to involve more than just the community and probably more than just the environmental agency. You're going to need to work collaboratively to try to come up with some more permanent solutions to some of the problems in EJ communities.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. And Laura, one of the things that makes the South Carolina DHEC presentation really stand out is the fact that the EJ Community Involvement Liaison sits in on important meetings with senior managers on a regular basis to make sure that the community's issues and perspectives are well understood and factored into decisions. Can you amplify a little bit on that process and, if possible, give an example?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, the public participation requirements that are in the regulations are really just the minimum, and it leaves a lot of gaps. So if you really think about what meaningful community involvement is, it is much more than what those requirements lay out. And so by having a member of the community engagement team at the Bureau management level, being able to provide the community perspective as issues are discussed, it has helped our management really see things through a community involvement lens, much more so than just through a meeting the requirements of a regulation type perspective. And to go back and kind of echo what Kelly just mentioned about a checklist, if we think about meaningful engagement, it is so much more than just following a checklist and what some regulations prescribe. And so by having the community engagement staff at those management level discussions, they are able to fill in those gaps and provide a perspective that makes decisions and even activities that the program promotes much more meaningful in terms of community engagement. So the technical staff, our management as well as our technical staff, they're really focused on meeting the minimums and ensuring that all of the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and focused on the regulatory requirements. But those community engagement staff really can give a much more broad perspective that really can get to the real needs of the communities that we serve.
Great. So we have collected a number of questions, and I'll just quickly run through them because we are getting short on time. The first one, Clean Air Carolina wanted to get a link to the Art of Commenting resources. Those are on the document pod. You can download the fact sheets related to that, as well as there is a resource fact sheet that has information about how you can get the book. This is what Laura McKelvey talked about in her presentation. Second question, Irina Carlos, I might not be pronouncing that right, wanted to get a link to the EPA's 2018 PM study. If you would email me, we will send you that information. So you know my email address is all over the place in the information around this webinar. And Gail Killingham wanted to know if there are similar trainings involving communities in water permitting. Does any of the speakers have any knowledge about that in terms of that third question?
This is Kelly. I'm not familiar with similar water trainings.
I believe at one point Office of Water had a relationship with the Institute of Tribal Environmental Professionals to do some training for tribal governments around water, but I don't know the status of that anymore. But I'm not aware of community-level trainings, but that doesn't mean it's not happening.
What we will do is research that, and you know, Gail, if you would email us to make sure that we have a correct way to communicate with you, we can make sure to follow up with that. I think those are the three questions that came through on the question pod, and so we're really running short on time now. So I think just want to bring it to a close by first of all thanking the speakers, Laura McKelvey, Kelly Harrigan, and Laura Boyce for their excellent presentations. I need to make sure to thank all the people that helped plan and bring this session together. These include Karen Sprayberry from South Carolina DHEC, Arturo Blanco and Gloria Vaughn from U.S. EPA's Region 6, and Elizabeth Kramer from EPA's Region 7. As always, I need to give a special thanks to Lindsay Walsh for staffing this project. She is the person that's really responsible for making sure that this entire project is turning out to be a great success. I want to announce the next webinar, which is going to focus on using comprehensive area-wide planning approaches to promote equitable development. This will take place on June 18th, 1 p.m. to 2:30 Eastern Time. And speakers will be Kate Mangoya from Groundworks USA, Drew Curtis from the Ironbound Community Corporation, and Frank McLaughlin and Riche Outlaw from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. So with that, I thank everyone for participating today and for filling out the evaluation, and we look forward to talking with you in June. Thank you.